19th century America contained a wide range of Protestant churches and organizations with different doctrines, practices, and forms. But by the 1830s, almost all of these different types of Protestant religions had a deep evangelical emphasis in common. They all believed in the importance, the centrality of converting others. Now, if we go back to the 17th century and the Puritans, we see an emphasis on the sinful nature of humanity, that the fact that we are all sinners at heart, at base. Salvation was completely in the hands of God. 19th century evangelical Protestants focused on sin as human action. They preached that sin was a moral choice, that one could choose to act sinfully or not. A second distinguishing feature of 19th century evangelicals were their approach to religious revivals. In the early 19th century, the revival meeting became a central instrument for provoking conversions. It was a deliberately orchestrated event that deployed a variety of spiritual practices to provoke conversions. This new style of evangelicalism has to be understood as a vast and powerful religious movement. By the 1820s, evangelicalism had become one of the most important cultural forces in American life. 19th century evangelicals very self-consciously saw this movement as a second Great Awakening. They considered themselves participants in a broad spiritual movement. The Second Great Awakening spawned a number of reforms aimed at curbing a broad range of social problems. Many Protestants believed that God expected Christians to make a heaven on earth, to eradicate sin from both their personal lives and their societies. Many reforms were local, personal, or non-controversial. Converts swore off drinking, for example. But reform movements became more diverse and contentious as their numbers and causes swelled. These reformers shared a deeply felt obligation to make the world better. Many focused on purging society rather than the individual from imperfection and sin. Radical political reformers called on government and society to end social injustices such as poverty, slavery, and women's oppression. Women led the charges in many antebellum reforms, from temperance to abolition. While leading these reforms, women gained the political traction to begin the first wave of U.S. feminism. Ironically, the view that women should remain relegated to the household played a role in encouraging women's participation in public movements. Women who rallied for temperance, for example, highlighted their role as moral guardians of the home. Participation in the abolitionist and temperance movements led many women to rally for the cause of their own oppression. In 1848, about 300 male and female feminists, many of them veterans of these other reform movements, gathered at Seneca Falls, New York, for a conference on women's rights. Attendees agreed to a Declaration of Rights and Sentiments based on the Declaration of Independence. It declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." The history of mankind, the document continued, is a history of repeated injuries on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. Perhaps the most divisive reform movement was abolitionism. Now, abolitionist sentiment in the North increased steadily after 1815. Increasingly, ministers, editors, and other leaders of public opinion spoke out against the evils of slavery. This early expression of abolitionist sentiment was primarily located in the North. By the late 1820s, however, it was clear that the abolitionist movement had entered a militant phase. 3 events in particular indicated this shift. The first was the publication of David Walker's Appeal. David Walker was a North Carolina free black man who moved to Boston. He had a bitter hatred of slavery, which did not decrease with his leaving of the South. Quite simply, Walker's Appeal was one of the most vigorous denunciations of slavery ever printed in the United States. Walker accused whites of not only betraying their political ideas, but their religious principles as well. Walker wrote, "America is more our country, blacks, than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and tears." The second important event that moves the abolitionist movement in a militant direction is the publication of William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831. The Liberator became known as the most uncompromising of American anti-slavery journals. Garrison was a believer in immediate emancipation, or immediatism, which condemned slavery as a national sin, called for emancipation at the earliest possible moment, and proposed plans for incorporating the freed men and women into American society. The last event that marked a shift in the resistance to slavery was Nat Turner's Rebellion. On August 20th, 1831, Nat Turner and a band of slaves attacked Turner's master's home. Through the night, they left a trail of ransacked plantations, decapitated bodies, and battered heads across Southampton County, Virginia. In all, 55 whites were killed. Most of the rebels were captured or killed, except Turner. He remained in hiding for 2 months before he was finally captured. Thomas Gray, the white attorney who took Turner's confession, characterized him as a complete fanatic. When Gray asked Turner, "Do you find yourself mistaken now?" his reply was not Christ crucified? Many abolitionists, both slave and free, now saw themselves as crusaders, attempting to save the soul of the nation or punish the sinners who stood in their way. The question of slavery only grew more intense as the nation expanded westward. Mexican independence from Spain in 1821 also exposed the region to American encroachment. Government explorers, traders, and trappers helped to open the West to white settlement. In the 1820s, thousands of Americans moved into Texas, and during the 1840s, thousands of pioneers headed westward toward Oregon and California, seeking land and inspired by Manifest Destiny, the idea that America had a special destiny to stretch across the continent. Such an idea put the U.S. in direct conflict with the newly independent Mexico. With the war and defeat of Mexico and the acquisition of nearly half of its territory, the nation's westward expansion to the Pacific was assured by the middle of the 19th century. As important was the question of slavery and the tensions the institution presented to the expanding nation. Abolitionists opposed its expansion. Pro-slavery advocates resisted restrictions on slavery's expansion into the newly acquired territories. Both the Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state and instituted a new, harsher fugitive slave law, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed the settlers of those territories to decide the question of slavery, were attempts to broker a deal to resolve the question of slavery. But by this point, both the North and the South were each firmly entrenched in their opposing views of slavery and the other region. Northern states passed personal liberty laws to counter the new fugitive slave law, while Southerners poured into Kansas to decide the question of slavery in that territory in their favor. By the presidential election of 1860, the issue of slavery completely divided the nation. Political parties divided over the question, with Democrats running 2 candidates, one from each region. This split virtually assured the victory of Republican Abraham Lincoln, and it is his election that convinces Southerners of the need to secede from the United States. So, the study questions for this week are: how do intensifying efforts to reform reveal the growing regional tensions in the nation? What role do Western expansion, resistance to slavery, and women's evolving public actions play in these tensions?